warm welcome. I'm Alexa Ahuja, PhD candidate at McGill University. I want to welcome everyone to the third talk of the semester. This event is co-hosted by the Plurilingual Lab Speaker Series, the Belonging, Identity, Language, and Diversity Research Group, as well as McGill DISE Research Talks. So today we're very grateful to have with us Dr. Sender Dovchin from Curtin University in Australia. So thank you so much for being with us so late for you and so bright and early for us. So today, Dr. Dovchin will deliver a talk entitled The Politics of Injustice in Translingualism, Linguistic Discrimination. So Dr. Dovchin will address the important gap today in translingual theories of sociolinguistics about disparity issues in translingual speakers' real-life language practices and situations. She will also show how these speakers are involved in different types of creative translanguaging practices in view of explaining how and why local constraints either limit or expand their linguistic freedom. So today, Dr. Dovchin will have 1 hour for her talk, and the hour will be video recorded. And then we will have a 30-minute discussion period. Here are a few important points about our Zoom etiquette. So during the talk, please keep your video and sound off. However, you can use the thumbs up and hands clapping features to interact virtually with the speaker after or during the talk. The talk will be available in the Plurilingual Lab YouTube channel shortly after, in a couple of days or so. After the talk, the discussion period will, as I said, not be video recorded for your convenience. You can post then your questions in the chat, or you can unmute your microphone and ask a question. Now, it might be better for my colleagues, Paul and Ben, who are going to be the moderators of the discussion, if you want to ask a live question, to just maybe enter your name or indicate in the chat that you would like to do so, so that you could enter the queue. Thank you very much. And Dr. Dovchin, the floor is yours. I will stop sharing my screen. Dr. Dovchin, are you with us? Okay.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you are. I'm here in Perth from Australia. It's 10 p.m. here, and it's been a long day for me. I've been up since 5 a.m. I had a very long day today, but I really wanted to see you, everybody. So I'm here now. So thank you so much for coming to my talk and participating in my talk. And also thank you so much for Plurilingual Lab for inviting me for this talk. So I'm Sender Dovchin, and I'm a senior research fellow at Curtin University, Western Australia. So today I will talk about my research, which is kind of recent research, which is funded by the Australian government's Australian Research Council. And it's called The Politics of Injustice in Translingualism and Linguistic Discrimination. So in order to present my research, first of all, I need to define the term translingualism. What do I mean by translingualism? So before discussing the concept of translingualism, I would have to start discussing a little bit of introducing the traditional frameworks such as bilingualism, multilingualism, and the related practices and terms code switching and code mixing. So when we talk about multilingualism, code switching and code mixing, we have this norm, right? So the norm is basically we have a few norms. So the main norm is person who command 2 or more languages, more than 1 languages or 2 languages or more additional languages. They use these languages in a way that does not in principle differ from the way in which monolingual practices so basically any language that is spoken purely or fluently is being mixed with another languages, and this cannot be met not only among the general public but also among some linguists. So people who command 2 or more languages will employ their full linguistic competence at any given time, and when they code switch or when they code mix with the other discussants, they use their full linguistic skills and full linguistic competence purely and fluently to be a bilingual and multilingual speaker. And speakers, multilingual speakers also use features belonging to different languages they know. And even without paying any attention, because they're so fully, aware of their linguistic practices, monolingual norms, they kind of naturally flow between these linguistic codes. So the norm is to try to count the number of languages and linguistic codes involved, and it focuses on the enumerative strategy of counting languages as singular entities. So for example, he's code switching between 2 languages, English and Russian. So he can speak 2 languages and he's bilingual, or he's speaking more than 3 languages, Japanese, Russian, or Chinese and Japanese. So we just kind of like count all these languages as singular entities, and then he or she becomes bilingual speaker or multilingual speaker, and code switching, code mixing. So these are the main norms of the multilingual speakers. But then, so code switching, speakers of more than 1 language, and they're known, their ability to code switch and code mix. And when they code switch and code mix, they know these languages during the communication. So for example, if you look at this example, look at this image, when someone is bilingual or multilingual, he or she, for example, using his Japanese knowledge separately, and then his Mongolian skills separately, his Chinese skills separately. So he's using all his language 1, language 2, language 3, language 4 separately, and we can actually count all these languages. So this is the main bi-multilingualism norm. But the traditional frameworks have been criticized recently by linguists, especially in recent years, recent decade or so. And you see some of these main scholars and some of the related works here. I'm sure you can see all these familiar names. So all these studies and scholars, they argue that traditional frameworks such as bi-multilingual framework they're focusing too much on languages rather than integrated linguistic resources. And they're sort of like in danger of unaccounting for late modern diverse language sort of styles and repertoires and modes. And it really makes little sense or no sense at all to classify all these diverse exchanges into bi-multilingual norms by counting, because all these people are unlikely to use pure or fluent languages. In fact, they are using this integrated styles, integrated linguistic resources to achieve their communicative resources. And because people are involved in complex linguistic sort of interactions, the association between linguistic codes and the association between linguistic resources should be understood in more sophisticated and complex ways. So we have to kind of like move beyond all these bi-multilingual sort of norms. So that's the main criticism of by multilingual speakers and traditional framework. So I kind of call this as post-bi-multilingual trend or tendency. So so all this post-bi-multilingual tendency, they tend to sort of argue that human communication, human brain, human linguistic behavior or interaction patterns appear to have become and continue to become very dynamic and mobile and complex. And they are all related to all these existing or changing scapes and resources such as technology, media, ideologies, and different communication, ethnoscapes, and so forth. Also, humans display these signs that they're not actually competent, or at least competent only to a limited degree in the various languages they borrow and mix. So rather than sort of counting these languages, we really need to look at the integrated human interaction from the recombination of multiple modes and codes, multiple repertoire speech and styles. So that's how they start looking at human interactions in late modernity. And based on that sort of critique, we have now a lot of new terms and terminologies coming out and emerging. As you can see, I can add, I can just fill up this tree of basically, I can add lots of terms, new terms and terminology almost every day. So I don't think I can catch up with all of them, but some of the main terms and terminologies, as you can see: translanguaging, translingual practices, transidiomatic practices, lingoscaping, metrolingualism, polylanguaging, translocalism, transglossia, transcripting, truncated multilingualism, chronotopia, crossing, and so forth. So we have, I also call it sometimes post-structuralist view in terms of language and linguistic diversity, and sometimes we call them transperspectives. So all of these new terms and terminologies, I called them as together as translingual approach or translingualism. So the main, for this, the main ethos of translingualism is basically multilingual communication starts not from the linguistic code, but it starts from the speaker. I mean, from my understanding, right? And the complexity of linguistic diversity and language is based on dynamics of a particular person's identity, particular person's social linguistic background, performance, and negotiation. And language and communicative resources constitute identity repertoires, which afford the adaptations to the contingencies of social life. So these are the main ethos of translingual perspectives. And people use this great range of territories, that come into contact. So do their communicative repertoires. And their communicative repertoires cannot be fixed, but they change. They're always in mobility. And language users employ whatever linguistic features or resources at their disposal to achieve their communicative aims as best as they can, regardless of how well they know the languages. And this entails that language users may know or may not know or use the fact that some of the linguistic features are perceived by some speakers as not belonging together or belonging together. So these are the main sort of ethos of translingual perspectives or translingualism. So I try to define, in my opinion, from my understanding, what I mean by translingualism in this study. Okay, so we can move on now to our next slide. So when I started looking at language from translingual perspectives, I recently started having problems because I started noticing that we are kind of translingual scholars. We have been kind of stuck with celebrating too much translingualism because it's exciting, because it's new, because it's a startup, or because it's dynamic. As you can see, you know, Mona Lisa is very exciting, and everybody has their own interpretations of Mona Lisa. But so same as translingualism, everybody has their own interpretations about translingualism, and we are celebrating the colorful, playful, and creative sides of translingualism. Here we have creative multilingualism, celebration of language and creativity, especially the online language and humor, playfulness, and translanguaging in online practices, including my books. The first one is I focused on popular culture and voices, and the other one is on the popular music. And we kind of celebrated translingualism in these books, looking at all this linguistic creativity and playfulness. And as you can see, all this translingual creativity, creative translanguaging creativity, it's all over about celebrating how people are using their available linguistic resources to celebrate translanguaging. And playfulness is other sort of main concept in translanguaging. You know, people are playing with languages to perform their identities. Translanguaging is about being playful, is about creating the second alternative lives and identities through playful linguistic resources and so forth. So I started having problems with all this creativity and playfulness because in my opinion, when we spend too much time celebrating the startups and not enough time celebrating the keep goings, because okay, we started looking at translingual, this new phenomenon, linguistic diversity and super diversity, and we're very excited about it, and we're very excited about looking at new languages and new communications and so forth. But for me now, you know, how about we start also looking at keep goings? How translingual speakers or translingualism is, you know, going forward, and what kind of questions do we need to ask about what is really happening in translingualism? Is it all these colorful, playful, creative features of language, or are there any other ways to think about it? So my question was, as Ryuko Kubota asks as well, you know, can all English users, regardless of their racial, gender, or socioeconomic or other background, equally transgress linguistic boundaries and create hybrid and fluid linguistic practices? And in my opinion, that's no, because I don't think all translingual speakers are, you know, in playful, creative sort of position to create their own identities through translanguaging and translingualism. And also some other scholars also started criticizing, you know, these creative approaches or plurilingual approaches. As Tupas and Rabdi, they argued that new translingual approaches towards bi-multilingualism seem to overlook the inequalities among the speakers and the relations between linguistic resources and language users, as we are being seduced into celebrating these inquiries over diversity of linguistic features and forgetting the massive inequalities and injustice sustained among you know, translingual speakers. And David Blocks also, he reminds us that it is almost impossible to develop a thorough analysis on people's apparent linguistic choices and practices without acknowledging the social class or socioeconomic, the capital and material backgrounds to make their linguistic choices. So in my opinion, we have to really go deeper, and we have to really ask ourselves again, what do we mean by you know, looking at translingualism from the perspective of not so colorful, not so playful, and not so creative perspective. So for example, in Australian context, we acknowledge that translanguaging is an important linguistic tool for Aboriginal young people to express their identities. But we don't really notice that Aboriginal speakers who are sort of, expressing their identity through translanguaging, they're also facing this massive injustice, massive discrimination based on how they speak English or just based on how they speak. So in 2016, in ABC's investigative TV program called Four Corners, they broadcast this footage, and that footage was obtained at a youth detention center in the Northern Territory between 2010 and 2015, and in which young Aboriginal Australians were seen being tear gassed and stripped naked and shackled to a chair. And though clearly this abuse of these young people was based on far complex issues, the teen inmate, Dylan Waller, he read a personal statement to the Northern Territory Youth Detention Royal Commission later, emphasizing that linguistic discrimination was their crucial factor of abuse. So I'll play this video for you.
Our crime is our punishment, not the continued mental and physical abuse that we continue to cop while we're here. On a number of occasions, I've witnessed officers abusing and yelling at Aboriginal men in here and putting them down because they can't speak English properly, and that's not fair and needs to stop. As a victim and a young man, I feel upset and let down by the system that these bad things were allowed to go on for so long. I really want to see these things change so it never happens to anyone else again, and I believe this Royal Commission makes sure that young people need love and someone to talk to, not to be locked in a cell with nothing for days on end. Trust me. Our crime is our punishment.
So as you can see, Dylan Waller, he basically said one of the main abuses in that detention center was because they couldn't speak English properly because they were heavily involved in translanguaging. So this is his handwritten note to the Royal Commission as well. So we should also again ask ourselves again, what is really happening to translingual speakers behind this playful and creative representation of linguistic performance or linguistic representations, and what is really happening behind online context, behind this playful online context, what is happening in offline everyday lives, in precarious situations, what is happening in the households with translingual speakers, what is happening in the public transport, for example, or what is really happening at schools or institutional settings or hospitals and other relevant contexts. So this is how the idea of injustice in translingualism sort of emerged from my current study, and I call it linguistic discrimination. Linguistic discrimination is also sort of heavily based on the works of some scholars' works, such as Ingrid Piller's work on linguistic diversity and social justice, and this book, Racial Linguistics, edited by Sami Alim, Rickford, and Ball. And there are also lots of other works on linguistic discrimination by Flores and Rosa, by Enrico Kubota, and recently my special issue in the International Journal of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism. So now what do I mean by linguistic discrimination? Basically, I started with the interlingual discrimination, which is kind of first suggested by Robert Phillipson and Turf Skadnap-Kangas. So interlingual discrimination is unequal relationship between minority and hegemonic language groups at the level of internations, where minority groups are not able to fully utilize their mother tongues in the critical social settings. And this may lead to ethnic conflicts, since particular minority languages are often linked to specific ethnic groups. And interlingual discrimination also resists these discriminatory linguistic practices, encouraging sort of revitalization of minority languages. But interlingual discrimination has been also criticized by, oh, sorry, I need to go and switch this light off. Sorry, guys. So intralingual discrimination is, it's sort of like criticized the works suggested by interlingual discrimination, because what they argue is, we also need to appreciate the internal intra-group linguistic discrimination. For example, in the Singaporean context, when Singaporean people speak Singlish, they get discriminated by elites or, other institutional contexts. So the sort of intralingual discrimination is sort of like the same linguistic and cultural background people, they discriminate each other in the same group. So the speakers of non-standard varieties of that particular standard language can claim to be discriminated against, and where the non-standard language users are judged to be less acceptable than their standard using counterparts. So intralingual discrimination has been suggested by Wee and Makoni. But I argue that we also need to move beyond the intralingual discrimination, because intralingual discrimination is sort of like in a very particular local context, looking at particular same cultural and linguistic background people discriminating each other. But how about now all these translingual speakers who are moving from one border to another, crossing borders, seeking better opportunity and better lives? How about these transnational identities who are moving around the world? When these people move, when these translinguals move in different locations, they're often positioned sort of in spaces, in multiple different uneven spaces and universes. And their particular translingual practice and their particular translingual background they bring with them are assigned to a massive different sort of values that are subject to translingual discrimination. So, and surprisingly, some translingual speakers can be valued really, highly, but some are sort of like in the bottom of the translingual indexicality, and different orders of indexicality in which transnational linguistic practice and backgrounds are operated with large stratified complexes where some forms of repertoires and resources are systematically perceived as not so valuable or valuable, and some others are less valuable and sort of like undervalued. So, so that's kind of translingual discrimination we're talking about, basically discrimination against transnational identities who are moving from one border to another, and who are sort of like identified as transnational identities. So, so now I'm going to present now some of the research data I have analyzed. So in my research data, so I worked with culturally and linguistically different background people in Australian context, and I sort of used the open ethnographic observation, and I also used semi-structured interviews. I also used the method of shadowing, that is discursive shadowing, that is spending time with them, talking to them on a daily basis, and so forth. And I can present some of the outcomes here. I can't present everything because I've got too much, but basically one of the very, very common practices or one of the most common experiences that these transnational identities face is ethnic accent bullying. So what do I mean by ethnic accent bullying? So basically bullying somebody based on their biographical accent, their biological accent, and how they speak English, and mockery and making fun of one's also heritage language and accents, and so forth. So this kind of ethnic accent bullying was really, really common among my research participants. So, for example, here you can see my research participant who is a Vietnamese background, and here she sort of explains to me, to the researcher, how she has experienced ethnic accent bullying. So linguistically, Van can be heard speaking fluent English with a strong Australian accent in the audio recording, which has been noticed by the researcher. And he says, and she says that it sounds to me very Australian English. And then the researcher intends to reassure and encourage Van self-confidence in her English, because Van still shows some kind of weakness in terms of her English skills. And then in the interview, Van says that she's working very hard in order to purify her Australian English accent by listening to Australian music and watching Australian news, hearing the conversations between the local Australians. And she also explains to the researcher that she started attending a local high school in Australia after she immigrated from Vietnam, and she started receiving this chronic bullying from her classmates based on her Vietnamese accented English. And she describes that as they were laughing because I was pronouncing wrongly, she says in line 4. Here in extract 2, Van further says that she started receiving ethnic accent and bullying from her classmates also in the forms of laughter, as you can see in line 5. And when she refers to pronounce English wrongly, she metaphorically indicates that her ethnic Vietnamese accent being target of the peer bullying. So the ethnic accent bullying in this regard seems to frequently occur in the form of laughing, or, my other research participants also have sort of noted in other contexts that, people would laugh at me when I pronounce certain words. People would laugh at or I get corrected based on how I speak English and so forth. So meanwhile, Van also started developing this suicidal ideation in response to her chronic ethnic, accent bullying. And she thinks that this ethnic accent bullying has sort of really affected her mental health. And she started, her mental health started decreasing due to the social withdrawal. And she started noticing herself being lost and depressed, which is, she's saying in line 1. And she also suggests that she was experiencing depression, and also started developing suicidal ideation in line 3. Yeah, so this is kind of example of the chronic bullying, including the ethnic accent bullying, and how it can affect some of my research participants. And this is, I'm just showing only Van's example here, but I can assure you that there are many other research participants who are in a similar boat and who share a very similar experience like Van in terms of accent bullying, and how they are mentally and psychologically, emotionally are destroyed by this bullying. Okay, so next example here is linguistic stereotyping. So linguistic stereotyping was the second main topic among my research participants. So what do we mean by linguistic stereotyping? So linguistic stereotyping is basically people who are not expected to speak particular language well, may be heard not to speak that language well, irrespective of their actual proficiency or skill. So basically language is judged based on how they look, and somebody's linguistic skill and somebody's linguistic proficiency is basically judged based on how they look. So it's pretty much really sort of related to race as well, based on how they look, based on their skin color, or maybe based on what they, wear and things like that. So no matter how they are good at that particular language, or no matter even if they were native speakers of that particular language, because they look different from that particular linguistic background, they can be stereotyped based on how they look. So that was another kind of main theme that has emerged from my data. So I can show you here another example here. Now you can see here Ilhan. So Ilhan is a she is a Somali Muslim girl. And she was born in New Zealand, but then she moved to Australia like 2 decades ago, and she speaks fluent Australian English, and she went to Australian high school and university and so forth. But she's a very traditional looking sort of, Muslim girl because she's sort of like her head is covered by this hijab and abaya, which is a traditional robe-like dress worn by some women in parts of the Muslim world, including North Africa. So she likes her traditional, clothes, and she likes wearing her hijab. So every time she goes out, she's dressed in traditional Muslim clothes. But here in this example, she says that every time she goes out, she's often judged based on how she looks. So Ilhan here describes that she has observed 2 types of people who seem to stereotype her English proficiency. And the first types are the people who seem to unintentionally make Ilhan feel awkward, because these people tend to get genuinely shocked by her fluency in English. So as soon as Ilhan starts speaking English, people cannot hide their candid shock or disbelief, because her English sounds just so perfect, right? So people would be like, oh my God, your English is so good. Where did you learn that? But for Ilhan, these kind of compliments kind of make her feel really worthless, because her first language is English anyway. So this is kind of a linguistic stereotyping. And this, we should understand that these kind of examples are very, very common for my other research participants as well. And also she also experiences this, signs of microaggressions, as people tend to pass these racial insults. And she's here explaining, she's explaining this one incident at the grocery shop, where in the checkout machine, she was waiting for the shop assistant to help her to sort the machine, and then an old lady approached her and she was like yelling at her, do you need help? As if she can't speak English, like very, sort of in a patronizing way, according to Ilhan. So we should remember that this kind of linguistic stereotyping happens almost every day to these culturally and linguistically different background people who are even native speakers of that particular language. Here another example, well, he's the Chinese background student in Australia, but he moved to Canada when he was in high school. So when I was talking to him, he just speaks really fluent, native like English in North American accent. But here, when says that, he says that when he came to Canada, people, started doing this linguistic stereotyping. And he notes that despite his high proficiency in English, even if your English is all right, even if you speak English really, really good, people still think you have this accent or something, only because he looks Asian, only because he has these Asian traits. So So looking Chinese is bound up with being perceived as the speaker of non-standard Chinese English, a type of English which seems to be inherently located in that dangerous zone of global English accents, along with other English accents such as Indian English or Japanese English or Korean English and so forth. So even if your English is fluent North American, you still can get discriminated linguistically based on how you look. Okay, and because of that, when he also, started feeling this sense of non-belonging, and he also mentioned about suicidal ideations, he tried to try to commit suicide when he was in Canada because he was like really depressed. And I don't think I have the slide here, but all these extracts or examples are taken from my latest article called Psychological Damages of International Students in Australia, if you're interested to explore more. Okay, so I think I'm going to conclude my talk soon. So overall, the politics of injustice in translingualism or linguistic discrimination is really, it's timely, and we really, as social linguists or applied linguists, we really need to concentrate on darker side of translingualism, what is really happening with these translingual speakers. I mean, considering the social linguistic implications of translingualism and current trend of critical applied linguistic, I think there is still a distinct lack of public understanding and a significant gap in academic knowledge on translingual speakers' challenges, their daily issues of linguistic, cultural, racial, religious intolerance in the wider society. So I think it is very crucial to raise awareness that translingual discrimination or linguistic discrimination in the politics of translingualism against people can be linked to the type of language or type of accents and repertoires they use. So especially in particular in the context of transnational space where translingual speakers attend in large numbers, the host society's presumptions based on stereotypes of the language and accents may pose serious psychological risks to these speakers. And we really need to consider that as applied linguists as well. And we really, I think, need to convey these messages to policymakers and psychologists and mental health practitioners as well. I think especially, yes, as scholars and advocates and human rights advocates and linguists, we sort of need to achieve, our aim is to achieve a very culturally and linguistically conscious, critically and creative forms of bi-multilingual education, bi-multilingual society and scholarship that would really include social inclusion and coexistence and so forth. So as a scholar, language scholar myself, I urge other fellow scholars, public intellectuals, psychologists, and mental health practitioners to really pragmatically apply our research into real life situations or into real bi-multilingual classrooms by becoming our research participants' voices and revealing their past, traumatic experiences and realities to address the broader sort of issues of racism and social injustice and so forth, and other human rights issues. So, so I just want to finish this talk with a very simple message. I know it's very simple. I know everybody knows this famous phrase, but never make fun of someone who speaks broken English. It means they know another language. So we need to remember this simple message, I guess, every day. Yeah, so thank you so much. And I think I finished a bit earlier, 50 minutes earlier, so I can start a discussion and so forth. And I'm really sorry, I'm really tired. Please remember it's almost 11 p.m. in Perth today. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dovchin. I think everybody can give you a warm round of virtual applause. This was a great, fantastic, and very enlightening talk. Thank you also for all the messages that you gave, the important messages that you gave in your conclusion.